everybody to the NABT Inclusive Teaching Symposium today on Thursday, March 2nd. I'm so excited for everybody that can join us here today. This is a pretty exciting teaching session, one that I really appreciate that we've been doing and one that we're able to get to do. So really, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. Before we begin today, I want to acknowledge and honor the indigenous communities of the region that I'm currently located in, which is Southern Utah, as the original possessors, stewards, and inhabitants of this 2D, and recognize the university I'm associated with is situated on the traditional homelands of the Ungwu Southern Paiute people. As we spend our time learning together, let us also reflect upon and honor the contributions and cultures of the indigenous peoples who walked in the places we know as home long before we were here. My name is Carrie Jo Buckland. I am the 4-year section chair this year of the 4-year section of NABT. So I'm going to be working with leadership and with the members of NABT to work through some business things for the 4-year section. I am also the notorious Region 8 coordinator, which means that I work with a lot of people in the Intermountain West region. So if you think I-15 from Nevada up, and then including Colorado, because they're good friends with us here. And then I also do a lot of work with pre-service teachers. I train students in methods and student teaching and things of that nature. So I have a interesting grasp on where teaching is in the sciences. I would like to thank the 4-year section, especially Ben England, for all of the work on the symposium. This initiative is designed for and open to all biology teachers, and we really hope to get increased representation as the program continues to grow over the next couple of years. This program is the 5th one of its kind since the new year, and there are more planned over the course of the year for NABT to host. If you'd like to get more information and updates about these events, ABT articles, or information about the annual conference, please consider joining NABT. You can find more information on our website, and everybody in the webinar is going to get a 25% discount code in the email after the webinar is closed. While we're going today, if you have any questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. This is going to be moderated by the leadership that's on the call today to make sure that we get everyone's questions answered in the time that we have allotted. I would like to introduce Ben England next. He's the coordinator of our symposium, and he's going to talk to you about how tonight's program is going to work.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Carrie Jo, for that setup and introduction. And thank you to all of our attendees who are here and able to make it. I'm very much looking forward to this. We have an exciting program of 4 talks lined up for you today. And how it's going to work is each talk has a designated sort of time. So our first talk here is our featured talk, and it's going to be 30 minutes, and that includes the Q&A portion of the talk. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a talk, including the Q&A. We're going to have a small segue into our second talk, and that's going to be 20 minutes, including Q&A. Another segue into our third talk, which will be 20 minutes, including Q&A, and then segue into our fourth and final talk, 20 minutes, including the Q&A. So if you have questions related to the presentation, please drop them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat. We want to make sure those questions get directed to the presenters. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first talk. So I am pleased to introduce Sarita and Ellie, Sarita Shukla and Ellie Theobald from the UW system, with a talk entitled Translating Research to Practice, Enacting Ethics of Care and Community Cultural Wealth in the Biology Classroom.
Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Ben. Hello and welcome everyone to our talk here today. My name is Sarita Shukla, and my colleague Ellie Theobald. We will be talking about this work on the basis of a recent essay that we co-authored with 2 other colleagues. But before we start that, I did want us to acknowledge where we are. So we join you today from the unceded lands and waters of the Sammamish and Duwamish tribes that are a part of the shared waters of tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations, where we are settlers. My name is Sarita Shukla, and I cannot see you all, but just a little bit about my own background. I started out as an elementary school teacher, taught 1st and 5th graders in India. And then sort of like years later, I found myself in a PhD program in educational psychology, where I have been very interested in looking at the social foundations of education. And so I currently teach in the undergraduate program, primarily within the School of Educational Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell. So that's a little bit about me. Welcome Ellie to share a little bit about her and our other colleagues.
Excellent, thanks Sarita. Yes, I am Ellie Theobald. I'm also an assistant teaching professor at the University of Washington. I'm on the Seattle campus and I'm in the biology department. So I came really to this work in a similar way actually to Sarita. I started after I graduated from undergrad, I started as a middle school teacher in Oakland, and then transitioned to a PhD program in ecologist. So I trained as a quantitative ecologist. And then now I have the privilege and luxury to teach in the introductory series at the introductory biology series at the University of Washington. So I teach a large enrollment class. This quarter I have about 590 students. Yeah, so I'm super excited to be here as well. I really appreciate the invitation from Ben and Jackie and the organizers. Totally appreciate all of you out there joining us. I also want to say that two of our two collaborators on this work, Joel Abraham and Becca Price, aren't able to join us today, but they were super, obviously super important contributors to this work. And together we all have some shared experiences that we're able to put forward in this essay. So really, in a lot of ways, before I transition to that, we want to just know who you are just a tiny bit, right? It's a little silly. So awesome. So Jackie just opened a poll for us. We just kind of want to see who you are, where are you coming from? So, when you're thinking about students, what kinds of students or what students are you thinking about when you attend this session all afternoon here? Take maybe 30 seconds to answer. And then I guess I'm a little new to polls in a webinar. I'm wondering if, oh, good. Okay, super. Yeah, I see it in the chat too. Chemistry, biochemistry. Awesome, Columbia College, totally great. I'm wondering, Jackie, if you're able to share the poll results. And totally fine to share them with everybody, just to kind of, so we all can get a sense of who we are here together. Oh, great. Okay, great. Let's see. Oops. Oh, I'm struggling with Zoom. Yikes, ouch. Wow. Okay, awesome, totally great. Yeah, so about 70% of us are at four-year colleges and universities. We have a number of students who are, or a number of participants, excuse me, who are thinking about graduate school students, a bunch of folks thinking about two-year college students, a bunch of folks thinking about high school and middle school students as well. Thank you for that and welcome. I'm sorry that we don't get to actually see you together. So this is probably an experience that you all can relate with also, but part of what brought us to this work, yes, great. Part of what brought us to this work is really our collective orientation towards equity in STEM classrooms, or in classrooms in general, but particularly in STEM. And for a long time, it has been very clear that achievement gap discourse, like how we talk about students in relation to the achievement gap, is really problematic. And right before we started this project together, this amazing paper from Daniel Quinn came out in 2020 and really emphasized for us the need for updated language, and more than just language, right? It's not just about finding and replacing the words in our language that are problematic and that we should replace, but really research frameworks or even teaching frameworks that we think about that we own. And this paper was interesting. It was very elegant, very simple, very elegant. I liked it a lot. They asked participants what your best guess is of the high school graduation rate for Black students in the United States. And they started by saying, the graduation rate for white students is 86%. What do you think is a graduation rate for Black students? So the truth is, the reality is that Black students graduate from about 78% of students who are Black graduate from high school. But the kind of cool thing about this paper is I actually, the participants, the respondents to this survey were randomized into two different groups. There was one group of students or one group of participants who watched a really inspirational video all about Promise Academy, which is in Harlem's Children's Zone, and it's a charter school that's really oriented towards student success. You see really wonderful pictures, videos of students with school of pride, students learning, students talk about what they value of school, stuff like this. And so participants in this study, in this Quinn study, estimated or guessed that the Black student graduation rate was 55%. I just want to pause for a second because that's a huge bias, right? Even with no treatment, this is what they're calling the counter stereotypical intervention or treatment. And even still, there was a huge bias. People, regardless of race, actually dramatically underestimate Black student achievement. But the part that really struck us is that the second group of participants watched a video with news anchors here, and it starts with disappointing numbers out of Minnesota today, the Black versus white achievement gap, and then goes on in kind of, in kind of that tone, and then also in that context. Folks who watched that video actually estimated the Black graduation rate, the graduation rate for Black students to be 48%. So this is not only a bias that we see, but it's a bigger bias from folks who watch this video that uses achievement gap discourse. And so for me, these experimental results show very clearly that our language matters. It has a huge impact on what people perceive, and it's really important that we change that. It's of course important too, like we'll loop at the very end, actually, I'll loop back kind of to this 55%, like even in, right, like we all have biases always, and they're made worse in some cases by language. And so that's really what started us on our journey for this essay. And really the achievement gap discourse has a couple of major problems, but kind of big picture and taking a step back, even specifically from achievement gap discourse, is the biggest problem is it really views students in a deficit framework. So it really, the whole framework around that term and around how we're conceiving research that interrogates the achievement gap is that it really connects learning to deficiencies. Right? In what ways are our students deficient? It also compares students, by definition, the achievement gap compares students from minoritized groups to students in dominant groups. And that is a problem if we're holding that dominant group as the ideal, as this is what we should all be striving towards. That's just a huge problem. And ultimately, it assigns the solutions primarily to students, right? Primarily to the folks who are at the lower end of that gap. And so that is a problem. And so in our paper, we set out to contrast these deficit frameworks with some systemic frameworks and asset-based frameworks that Sarita will tell us about now.
Thank you, Ellie. So while we can start thinking about the achievement gap and the ways in which researchers have conceptualized research around achievement gap and really looking at the score differentials, One of the ways in which we found researchers talking about the achievement gap was from a deficit lens, right? However, there are other researchers and other research studies that look at the notion of the achievement gap, but bring in other frameworks. Now, given that the frameworks that we will be talking about are the ones that we've addressed in the paper itself, they are not exhaustive. We would definitely like to shine light on a couple of these frameworks. So in this set of frameworks, when we look at the opportunity gap and then the education debt framework, we really are asking questions about the systems of power and privilege, and that explain and really interrogate educational outcomes. What are the structures of inequities, discrimination, food and housing insecurity, maybe poorly resourced schools that explain these outcomes? So rather than going in and blaming students, these sets of frameworks, the opportunity gap and then the education debt, really forces us to take a step back and then asks us to focus more on society and institutions at large, and asking questions around the differential educational outcomes using that lens. And then the other set of framework, the other sort of the one that you're seeing in peach now, looks at this question of educational outcomes in a sort of like a different light, right? So in the asset-based frameworks, the emphasis is on realizing that that students and instructors, they bring personal, cultural, and other assets. And then these assets, they have value, and the assets-based approach, it really tries to emphasize and tries to bring in, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to find ways to acknowledge, affirm, and amplify assets that an individual brings to a teaching learning space. Now, as we go into in this talk, Ellie and I, we will be focusing more on the peach colored, so the two frameworks, the community cultural wealth, and then the ethics of care framework. So we will be talking more about these two frameworks, with the understanding that there are lots and lots of other frameworks that have been used to make sense of the notion of the achievement gap. The other important point to keep at play is that we will be sharing examples from past research where researchers may or may not have used these frameworks to conduct research around the achievement gap. However, we are imposing a layer of meaning to this existing work, right? And going back to the point that Ellie was making, and that is one big thing that we address, is the importance of really thinking about shifting not just our language, but also how do we shift our research frameworks that acknowledge and respect the student histories and empower them. So let's go ahead and let's do a deeper dive then into the community cultural wealth and ethics of care framework. So the first piece that I wanted to talk about when we look at the community cultural wealth framework is it's important to take a step back and really ask questions about teaching, learning, and about education. Now, education is not value neutral, and Western paradigms, they have been the dominant ideology that affect how we teach and engage in fundamental and contemporary ideas in science. Teaching learning happens in a way that centers a universalistic approach, and it may marginalize diverse students' ways of knowing, understanding, and interacting in the world. This in turn makes diverse students feel devalued and may push students away from participating in STEM. So then the question that community cultural wealth that it draws upon critical race theory. And really the question is about the forms of knowledge and the capital that students bring, that traditional cultural capital theory does not recognize or value. right? So whose knowledge is important? What kinds of knowledge is valued in STEM? What kinds of perspectives are not being presented? What is valuable in that setting, right? So really starting to grapple around this. And so we drew upon Tara Yoso's work. And then on the next slide, we have this figure that comes from her work, and really looking at what are the different forms of capital that diverse students bring into a classroom setting. Now, these different forms of capital that you're looking at, aspirational, familial, social capital, navigational, resistant, linguistic capital, they are not exclusive. But they do build upon one another. And so really starting to think about how can we use knowledge that students are coming into our spaces with, how do we amplify that and in the content that we are teaching? How do we keep at play that all students that come to our classes, they are not empty voids that need to be filled, but they do come in with varied cultural knowledges that we can sustain. So critical race theory suggests that communities of color, they nurture cultural wealth through at least these several forms of capital. I'd like to highlight and talk about two of these for a little bit here. And so the first one that I wanted to talk about is social capital, and thinking about the networks of people and community resources that our students are coming in with. The peer and then the social contacts that students come in with, they provide instrumental and emotional support to navigate through our educational institutions as well. Another form of capital that I try to really think about in my own work with students is this idea of navigational capital. And so navigational capital, so what we're trying to do is thinking about skills of maneuvering through social institutions that acknowledges individual agency within social systems. I wanted to share a few examples from my own work with students here. I teach on a campus, and I was just looking at this data where 42% of incoming first-year students and 40% of new incoming transfer students, they are first in their immediate family to earn a four-year degree. 29% of our students at my institution, they are eligible for Pell Grants. Right? So when I just start looking at who is coming into this space, I really start thinking about what can I do in my work that really builds upon this notion of social capital and navigational capital. One thing that I try to do on my syllabi, for instance, is to use the term student hours instead of office hours. And when I use the term student hours, just to indicate that this is the time that I've set aside for you. And so ways in which I try to make transparent, sort of like how do you navigate across institutions of higher education. I also share my own examples of how I've navigated college. And so to do that work with students as well. Very quickly, I wanted to talk about another example from prior research, wherein Thompson and Jensen Ryan, what they did was they went in, they tried to identify what forms of scientific cultural capital that research mentors typically value. And so then those are the kinds of cultural capital that surface in sort of like in mentoring settings. And they found that if students had, for instance, family science exposure, they had an interest in science, they demonstrated leadership, then those students were more likely to be identified by their mentors as science people. And so Thompson and Jensen Ryan, what they then do is they ask us to really expand this notion of thinking about science people. And then on the next slide, I've shared examples of ways in which we can really start thinking about community cultural wealth to mentor undergraduate students in research. So maybe members of faculty can actively recruit students into their labs from programs aimed to promote the diversity of students, rather than insisting that students approach them with their interest to work in the lab. They can recognize undergraduate students may not express interest in research careers initially, but that research experience is still formative. So just as an example of how we can start thinking about expanding this notion of community cultural wealth to bring in those perspectives. So I'll hand it over to Ellie, who will talk about the ethics of care perspective next.
Super, thanks, Sarita. Yeah, so like Sarita said, I'm going to dive into the ethics of care to really understand what that framework is and try to help translate some of the research into practice. And ethics of care is a framework that, oops, I didn't advance, huh? It's a framework developed by Nell Noddings in the late 80s, actually, and it's totally beautiful. And I would be willing to bet, not a betting woman, but I'd be willing to bet that many of you in the Zoom webinar actually employ this ethics of care, but maybe don't name it that way. I find strength sometimes in naming things, and so we're hoping to do that for you a little today. So ethics of care is really founded on 3 principles. So the first one is just a deep care that instructors have for their students' success, both their students as a whole person, but then also their success in the classroom. This is, of course, not to be conflated with just being nice, because it's not about niceness. It's about a deep care for the success of students. This care is paired with extremely high standards for students, high expectations, high standards. But of course, those high standards then are supported. The instructor explicitly supports students in various ways to achieve those high standards. I really like the pairing of community cultural wealth and ethics of care, or we do. When I say I mean we, like our team really does, right? Because community cultural wealth really focuses on what the students bring to the classroom, which is beautiful and important. And ethics of care really focuses on what the instructors bring to the classroom, which is also important to acknowledge what we do and what more we can do. So with these 3 big ideas in mind, there's lots of ways that instructors demonstrate ethics of care or their ethic of care. So, you know, even just like first principles, in a lot of ways, teaching as a profession is a manifestation of our ethic of care. But even beyond that, what we do as instructors, so even all of that formative assessment that we do, like how far along this journey are we getting our students? Are we getting them to the success that we want? Are we there yet? What more can we do? All the pedagogical content knowledge that we develop, we hone so intentionally over our careers teaching, right? Oh, this is a really challenging topic for students. How can I help them better learn that particular content? Really, those things that we do are a demonstration, a manifestation of our ethic of care. There are lots of other things too from the literature that, again, in our paper, we've tried to kind of reimagine some of the DBER literature in particular, but education literature a little bit more broadly also, with these new frameworks. And again, naming what the authors did not name, but naming it in a way so that we can help move beyond achievement gap discourse specifically. So for example, all of the instructor talk that Seidel and company put forward, right? All of the non-content things that we say to our students, like, oh, I really respect that everybody is coming at this from a different place. Let's pool our knowledge and move forward together. That kind of talk is a demonstration of ethics of care. Similarly, right, the growth mindset stuff, all the work from Canning and others who demonstrate that when instructors really truly believe that intelligence is malleable and can grow as students grow, that that is a demonstration of an ethic of care. Also, all the active learning and high structure literature is also a demonstration of the ethic of care, right? An instructor has high expectations for students, high standards, and throughout their class, they provide opportunities for students to practice that exam or assessment aligned activities, and instructors caring about helping students succeed in a particular class. So adding structure, preparatory materials, or practice exams explicitly, or multiple exams instead of just one. These are all demonstrations of ethic of care. Similar, this of course ethic of care leans heavily on, or perhaps inclusive teaching leans heavily on ethics of care as well. They're very married to each other in a lot of ways. And then finally, linking back to the Quinn paper that we started off with a few minutes ago, right? All of the self-education that we do to work to identify our own biases and work to disrupt them, we do that because we care, and because we care about the students in our classroom. So there's a really neat paper, Gutierrez from 2000, really kind of illustrated this ethic of care. Again, didn't name it this way, but I want to name it for you. This doesn't, the application of this framework does not have to be an individual instructor in their individual classroom. And this Gutierrez paper re-envisioned ethic of care at the departmental level. So this was it was in K-12, but same would apply in any institution. Ultimately, the department, it was a math department. All these folks really, their goal, they were working towards student success, of course. But this department had a really, the definition of success was oriented around problem solving, like valuing problem solving more than just valuing getting the correct answer. In addition, the faculty in this department had a really dynamic conception of who students are, right? It's not just, oh, this one student walks into my classroom and that's it. But the student is coming with a lot of lived experiences. They're coming with their own valuable and unique perspectives. And a student's identity can change over time, both throughout the course of a single course, but also as they progress through college or through the year or years. The neat thing about that is it really inspired instructors in this department to really reflect deeply and frequently on who their students are, how they're working, pushing students towards meeting their goal of success. It inspired a lot of innovation in the classroom. So trying new things, trying to improve upon what they had done previously. And the cool part about this particular department too is that the instructors actually rotated through the classes. So every instructor knew all of the content or all of the series that students would take. And that provides a new and like more nuanced view of a student's experience in their class. And then finally, in this department, all of the faculty really committed to their students, they committed to the program, and they committed to each other deeply. And in this way, it really demonstrated a departmental level ethic of care. So I want to invite you, invite you to envision this occurring in a couple of different ways. So I teach introductory biology, and so I can envision this kind of systems level ethic of care happening if, every time I talk to the upper division biology instructors, right? What can I do to help my students be prepared for your class, right? That is rooted in my care. Same thing, you can think about horizontal transfer as well, or horizontal collaboration, right? My students are taking chemistry classes at this very moment, at the same time. So anytime I talk to my chemistry or physics or math or English or any instructors across campus, that really, and with the explicit goal to help students in these classes succeed, that's a demonstration of ethic of care. So I'd love for you to just think about these frameworks for a second and think about what you already do. And I don't know, I've felt very hopeful lately. There's a lot to be not hopeful about. But I think being intentional about being hopeful is also super important. And so what will you do? What might you do moving forward? So we'll end there for now. We totally invite questions. We'll stick around for the rest of the session too, if there are questions at the very end. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you. And yes, certainly welcome and invite questions.
Well, thank you so much, Ellie and Sarita. I'm monitoring here the Q&A. And we do have a question, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. Regarding ethics of care, student success will mean different things, such as high grades, consistent attendance, or getting work in on time. How would a teacher know what student success is and help students to achieve their own success?
I can attempt to answer this question for a little bit. So I keep grappling with this question. One way in which I've been trying to address this question of defining student success in a way that students define their own success is by using alternate grading strategies in my class space. So this quarter itself, I'm combining specification grading and mastery grading into my class. And I invited students at the beginning of the quarter to share sort of like what grade are you working toward? And then, what are the assignments that will help you to get to that? And as I think about defining student success, I'm also sort of like sobered by Lisa Delpit's work and thinking about other people's children, sort of like how, what kind of an education do I want for my own kids? What kind of an education do I want for other kids? And really thinking about also, while we allow our students should be defining the way that they are making sense of their own success. At the same time, as an instructor, how am I inviting them into the rules of my own discipline, right? So also thinking about success in that context. So just sort of like beginning to answer that question. Ellie, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add. I really appreciate that question because I think it gets at something that I agree with so deeply, that my definition of success might not be your definition of success or a student's definition of success. So I think, like Sarita is saying, inviting students in to think about how they would like to define success and then helping them get there. I think it's interesting thinking about that. I think about scale a lot, partly because in the fall I have 1,100 students all in two different sections, and so I can't possibly have a grade contract, for example, with all of those students. But at the same time, how I try to help students understand kind of where, a couple of things. One is what their grade in this class means and like actually means, right? I think sometimes students fall into the trap of conflating a grade with potential. That's not true, right? Or conflate grade with, some students conflate how well they do with, their value as a person. And that is horrible. And I try really hard. I message about that quite a lot. I think the other thing is I really try to engage students with the idea of how can we improve. Right, sure, maybe that first exam didn't go well. Well, you have lots of opportunities in this class. 3 more exams, you can drop your lowest grade. So how can we orient towards improvement on the second exam and third and fourth? And so I think that can help also define success. It's complicated though too, right? Because there's external forces that try to define success for students. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. We do have time for one more, so I will take the first one that I saw here come in. How do we create a model for scholars, students to be successful? Would creating a community agreement of what success is in the course be sufficient enough?
So we are talking about creating a model of student success. Now, that is interesting. And I think that going back to the points that Ellie was making, really seeing and sort of like even thinking about how do we define success in our classes too? What do I mean by success? So sharing that out with students upfront, that your participation in the class matters, and that when you do have, sort of when students do the work in classes, it is not just sort of you get the grade and you're done with the points that you earned for the first time, that it is cumulative, that you can learn from this past experience that you've had, and allowing for revision. And I do that in my capstone classes. Students do revise the work that they do, and then they can continuously work toward improving the writing that they do for the class itself. So really seeing success as cumulative is a model that I work toward, that it's not just sort of like one kind of like one done kind of a deal. And also that the emphasis, at least when I think about what is the explicit curriculum that we're teaching toward and what's the implicit curriculum. And then I think when we think about the model of success, to me, that is sort of the implicit curriculum too of the course. And so if we have, and the way that I think is, if you have sort of these high stakes tests and exams and just really the one time that you can just do well, sink or swim approach, then in that case, the message that we are giving to students is far different than when we say, you do the work, how can you revise, how can you grow, how can you improve? So there are different models of success that we can then project and even share out in terms of our own thinking about success.
Can I add one thought, Ben? I'm so sorry. Super fast.
Yes, very fast. Thank you.
Very fast, very fast, very fast. I think the only other thing that I would say is I also try to help students understand that success does not mean lack of failure, right? It means when failure happens, learning from that and growing from that and doing better. And we do that in a variety of ways in our classes. But I'll stop now because it's not my turn anymore.
All right. No, that's a great point. Thank you so much. I know there were some other questions. I do need to keep us on schedule. But thank you so much, Ellie and Sarita. And you provided your emails as well. So perhaps some questions will come your way that way. So with that, I would love to introduce our second talk. So without further ado, Tara Jo Holmberg from Northwestern Connecticut Community College will be talking about disabilities and life sciences, equity, inclusion, and universal design.
Thank you so much. And what a wonderful talk to kick us off. So I am actually going to be bringing the scale and scope down to a narrower focus, and that is on students and disabilities in the life science classroom. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge that I am situated within the traditional and unceded territory of the Wappinger Confederacy of Tribes here in Northwestern Connecticut, which is a land with a rich history of Indigenous cultures, including the Mohican and Pawcatuck tribes. So thank you so much for having me here today. I am coming to about this topic as a practitioner, as an educator. My background is for 21 years now as a community college educator, but I've also taught in the K-12 system as a middle school math and science teacher. So the four big buckets that I wanted to talk about today are kind of what is meant when I talk about disability and inclusion in life sciences. What is disability? What does that mean? And I'm going to piggyback off of some of the terminology from the previous talk in terms of looking at this and what does this mean for those that are disabled and how they would like the world and how we would like the world to look at us. And then move into the landscape of disability within STEM and STEM frameworks, and then to talk about some different strategies and things that can work. Obviously, this is 20 minutes, so I can only give a brief outline, but I will be sharing some resources that can help afterwards. So to kick us off with just a reflection and to do this on your own, when someone asks about what is inclusion in the classroom, we often have a picture in our mind. So what is the first thing that pops into mind when we talk about inclusion in the classroom? And the second reflection question is, who or what might we be leaving out unintentionally when we're planning and when we're teaching? And so for both of these, it recognizes that we have a positionality. These are just based on the fact that we are people in the world, and we come into our teaching spaces with our backgrounds, with our cultures, with our education, with our own biases, and that in turn shapes how we plan and how we teach. This diagram that you see here is actually used for talking about design, and in particular designing for individuals with accessibility needs. But I think it actually works really well for teachers and students as well. So when we come into a teaching space, we have designed a lesson, we have designed an activity, we are designing some thing for students to do or to learn about, and we kind of have in our mind's eye, whether we know it or not, what that will look like. Depending on our own perspective and our own coming into that space, some students are included in that space and some students are not included in that space. We may shift our teaching along the way once we notice that not all students are kind of keeping up or maybe aren't able to actually do the work. But at the same time, there tends to be some students that are not included in the activity, the learning, the lesson. The idea is that as we go through more work and as we go through more training, as the webinars like this help provide, that the space of the excluded gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Now, when we talk about this positionality, and this includes work that's done through justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work, it can include things from education, as I mentioned, gender, language, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, identity, disability, age, life stage, family status, and socioeconomics. And so I think it's worth all of our time whenever we're doing this work and in these spaces to kind of think about where we as individuals are situated and what does that mean for what we bring into the classroom. For myself, just to be completely explicit, I sit into the dominant categories for most of these. I am a woman, I am white, I am married, I am cis, I am disabled. So I am coming as a disabled educator to this space and talking about it from work that I've looked at, that I've done, not necessarily as an expert in this field, but as one who's doing this work and looking through this work and looking through the research. So what do we mean by disabilities? So disabilities come in many, many, many different forms. This is just a capturing of a few different kinds within some of the major categories that disabilities are kind of put into containers. A couple things to note is that 25% of the US population is classified as having a disability. So that's somewhere to upwards of 90 million people from birth to adulthood. Individuals can have more than one disability at a time. Some individuals would like to have language used that they have a disability. and some would like to say that they are disabled. And it's up to the individual to decide what kind of language they like to use to identify themselves. I personally go back and forth, depending on saying I'm disabled or I have a disability. Some individuals may qualify as being disabled, but don't want to recognize that they have a disability, and that's their right as well. When we look at this, we can see there's a whole spectrum of different abilities and different needs that students may have in our classrooms. And this can make it a big challenge for us as educators to address the needs, the accommodations, and what students need in terms of especially STEM learning. So when we're talking about disabilities in general, I think it's important to note that, first of all, the ADA, which set the standard for the US, is one of the latest civil rights era laws that was passed. It wasn't until 1990, so it's just over 30 years old. And it set what is now known as the medical model of disability. It, in a way, can be thought of as a deficit model. And so this is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. In order to qualify for benefits, for example, under the ADA, there is a lot of work that needs to be done. Thankfully, for students to qualify for 504s, IEPs, or accommodations in higher ed, it is not as difficult as it is to qualify for benefits. However, this model still looks at individuals with disabilities as oftentimes needing to be fixed or not as quote unquote normal. Instead, the social model of disability is one that many disability advocates and those working in disability justice work under, recognizing that there are limitations with this model as well. The WHO has a couple of pieces of language that I think kind of help sum it that's pretty well, and I'm just going to read the one at the bottom, which is disability and context. So this is not to say that it's not recognized that there are some significant health challenges with some disabilities, but instead recognizes that the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she has lived is complex, and they often don't match. And so instead, this model says the societal constructs can change so that they are more accommodating, more adaptive to all bodies, to all people, to all needs, rather than fitting a narrower scope for some. In other words, disability is not just a personal health condition, but disability is about mismatched human interactions. I really like this graphic that kind of sums up a lot of the work with inclusivity and disability. Specifically, that people with disabilities belong, that they have a right to dignity, and that they have a right to justice in cases where things are not being done either legally, ethically, or morally. And so with that, we bring in a lot of different ideas, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different things that are being missed out when a quarter of the population is not being accounted for in many spaces. So what does this mean for disability in STEM education? So one of the things that we see is, first of all, we can focus STEM education either on instructors with disabilities or students with disabilities, because there's actually literature in both areas. So we're going to stick with students and just look at a student focus for this. And specifically, remember I said that 25% of the population is disabled according to the CDC, and this is one or more disabilities. But in secondary education, only 12% of students get accommodations. So that means that in secondary ed, there's about 13% of students that would qualify that aren't getting accommodations that are part of the quote unquote general student body. In addition, when we look at higher level STEM courses, specifically within the life sciences, we only see about 1% of students in those courses being having recognized the disability. So where are those students going? Well, unfortunately, earlier in education, they're often tracked out of STEM courses. They're tracked out of biology, they're tracked out of chemistry, they're tracked out of physics, and they're tracked into courses where they just aren't given the same opportunities. It gets even less in post-secondary education, as you might imagine. So only 10% of students in higher ed actually are disclosed as having a disability. There's a whole list of other reasons: loss of 504s, loss of IEPs, loss of kind of that institutional support. But we see less and less in STEM field. We know we have a leaky pipeline in STEM, and part of the leakiness is we're losing students who could do that work, could do have great careers in STEM, but just aren't being encouraged to do it because they're having been diagnosed with a disability. In other areas of marginalization, we see that an expectancy effect occurs. So we saw that in the earlier talk about the high school graduation rate for Black students versus white students and what was predicted based on what was the treatment. Not as much work has been done with disabilities, the expectancy effect, but we can expect that some of the same expectancy effect is responsible for what we're seeing. Unfortunately, in the landscape of research, the amount of research being done on students with disabilities has actually gone down in the last 20 to 30 years. There's not a great deal understood about why that is, but in a scoping study to look and see just how many journal articles were out there about students with disabilities, it's less than 1% on student marginalization is about students with disabilities. So there's still a lot of work to be done to understand a lot of these really complex ideas. So to look at systemic barriers in STEM, so these are really the big picture systemic barriers, and I think we can all see these, you know, no matter what kind of context we're teaching in, is time accommodations. These include classroom time accommodations, these include testing, these include things like time on task. And unfortunately, we all have time limitations. And so if we have students that need extra time, that need extra processing time, sometimes we do not have that in the schedule with start and end times for classes. The learning environments may not be built for all students. So there may be distracting environments. There may be classroom issues that may get in the way of learning. And this actually goes with things like task execution as well. Do students have everything that they need to be able to perform the tasks with their accommodations or even without their accommodations? Can they do the tasks needed? Is the built environment best for all students, not just students with disabilities? And I see this regularly in a lab situation. You know, even if the lab conforms to the letter to ADA, it may not be in the spirit of ADA, and therefore make it still difficult for students to navigate whether they have a physical disability or not. Lack of accommodation services. So these can be a financial, this could be a financial reason. There could be a number of different reasons why accommodation services are not forthcoming. Sometimes it's you have one accommodations individual for thousands of students, and there's just no way that they could keep up with that kind of workload. So accommodation services is a weak point in this chain. And then there is work being done, and the resources that I have, there is work published on implicit and explicit bias for instructors. I think that this is something that is, I'm hopeful as it becomes more and more part of conversations about inclusive teaching, that these are basically brought into the same realm as many of the other conversations for instructors in general to be able to kind of look within and see where some of the blind spots might be. So inclusive strategies, and I have the ellipses here for disabilities, because inclusive strategies are good teaching strategies for all students. So whether a student needs extra processing time or not, there may be another student who does not have a disability who's struggling with that particular concept and might need their own extension of or additional processing time. So I think just good teaching practices are good teaching practices. And I'll talk a little bit more about universal design in a minute, but the ideas here are not exclusive to looking at students with disabilities. So the first is more training and more workshops and things like that to just raise awareness of some of the issues. And this includes everything from instructors, lab assistants, TAs, administration. Additional time to complete tasks as needed. And this might be lessening some of the stuff and spending more time on active learning, spending more time on process. Consideration of lab groupings in learning environments. So this includes heterogeneous groupings and not putting, for example, all students with disabilities together and making sure that everyone has an equal chance to work with everybody else. The use of assistive technologies. So this includes both training for instructors, and this includes making sure what works best for the student is what works best for the student and isn't necessarily just applied onto them. That there's a wide array of learning opportunities, and representation really matters. So students being able to see disabled scientists out in the field, hearing about them. And this again is for all types of marginalization, not just for students with disabilities. And finally, one of the hallmarks from the disabled community is nothing about us without us. And so this is bringing students into the conversation. And to go back to assistive technologies, asking students what works best for them and finding ways to work with them to help them be successful rather than kind of a top-down approach. So very quickly, because there's lots of training out there, one practice one strategy that I want to mention is universal design for learning, also known as UDL. And again, the principle behind this is that it is usable by all people. So it is not just for those with disabilities. It's from CAST, which is a great organization and does all kinds of webinars and things like this. But it is an approach that is about design for both teaching and planning, but it's also about things like ethics of care and some of what we heard in the previous talk. So for example, just to use a physical ability issue here, someone who has only one arm, someone who has a temporary situation like a broken arm, and someone who's carrying something all need the same accommodations for a period of time. And so by designing for the expectation that there might be some people who might not have both arms available to them at all times is something that reaches a whole swath of people, not just those individuals that have a permanent disability of just one arm. So the main principles of UDL would include engagement. So how to engage learners of all abilities from all backgrounds and all levels of capital. Representation, not only in terms of seeing themselves, but also what kinds of things are being used and are they accessible. So how are what the visuals are that are being used. If you notice, this presentation is very plain, and that's intentional for individuals that have visual disabilities, have color blindness issues, so that it's as easy on the eye as possible. And then action and expression. So in what ways can individuals take action for their learning, and how can they show that learning? You know, a variety of different learning, like formative assessments versus summative assessments, labs versus activities in class. That is not all just one type of learning. And again, it's good teaching, whether or not an individual has a disability. So with that, I want to thank everyone, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. The document that I have is in progress, so you can revisit it as I put more things in, but there are some helpful tips and websites in there, as well as journal articles for everyone if you are interested. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We have time for, I think, one question, which is what we have. So I'm going to go ahead and read that. How do we encourage students to come forward at the beginning of the semester and let instructors know that they need access support? Oftentimes, instructors are unaware until later in the semester when accommodation letters are sent.
So that's a great question. And it's, it's part of that. How do you get across to students when they don't know you on day one or week one about your own ethic of care? So I think being really explicit with students about what kinds of things you are willing to help them with, why, how, in what capacity, what your availability is. If they're not comfortable talking to you personally face to face, will they accept, will you accept an email? Although I will say be careful with some of that because it's HIPAA. And so, I do tell a lot of my students not to disclose too much medical information because, then you now have their medical information, and that can be problematic if it's in a email trail. But I think trying to be as explicit as possible about how you care for them, their success, their well-being, as was stated in the earlier talk, and to just restating that often so that they do feel comfortable when they're ready to come to you. And sometimes they may not be ready, and that may have come from before. They may have had a bad experience or something like that. But I think being as open and as honest as you can with your own perspective and how you're willing to help is critical.
All right, thank you so much.
Thanks.
So we have reached our halfway point. I'm going to go ahead and say, let's take a 3-minute, set a timer, 3-minute bio break. And if you're sticking at your computer, you should be seeing a poll or question. Let's just try to get a sense of sort of where we are right now. I'm asking you to select the time zone where you're currently located. All right, looks like we're drawing heavily from the east, or at least the eastern time zone. 55% from the east, about 30% central time. And actually, it's a nice little descending histogram, 10% mountain and 6% Pacific. All right, thank you for that. We have about 1.5 minutes, and I will introduce our third talk here. All right, welcome back. We'll go ahead and get started here. It's my pleasure to introduce our third talk today. So please join me in welcoming Melissa Haswell from Delta College, who will be speaking on behalf of several other presenters as well for a talk entitled Curriculum Intervention for Anti-Racism in Biology.
Thank you. And I'm not able to share my screen because I think someone's still sharing.
Okay, TJ, I think you're still sharing. Jackie, I'm not sure if you're able to unshare. Okay. All right, there, then it should
There
work
we
now.
go. Thank you. Okay, well, welcome everyone. It's great to be here. I am really excited to present some of the work that we've been doing for a curriculum intervention for anti-racism and introductory biology. So I'm Melissa Haswell, and I'm presenting on behalf of our quite large team. So the team is led by Tess Kilpack and Brian Dewsbury, and then I'm part of this team, as well as Lisa Uri and Stephanie Bloomer. And we actually are supported with this work through a grant from the Spencer Foundation. So I wanted to also give a land acknowledgement. So I'm in the Anishinaabe Nation, which is an established union of the Ontario Indians, which was established in 1949. And this nation is actually part of a more older group of the Confederacy of the Three Fires. And so they are also known as the People of the Three Fires, which includes the Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi Indians. And so I actually live very near the Ojibwe, which are also called Chippewa. And actually my alma mater was actually works with the local tribe to allow them to use that as our mascot. So very proud Chippewa here as well, just by name. So I just wanted to give a little background on how we became a team, because we're such a large team. It actually started during the pandemic. And so a lot of us were experiencing a lot of turmoil with the George Floyd incident, as well as other incidents of racism in our country. And so we started a book group. There was actually quite a large book group through several organizations that many of us belonged to. And so Brian was actually our book group leader, and we were discussing how to be an anti-racist. And our group got along so well and enjoyed each other's company. So we decided to, hey, let's listen to some podcasts. And it ended up being over a year and a half of these discussions and just monthly debriefs to get us through the pandemic and all the things that were happening in this country. And so then we started talking about how we implement such a work into the classroom. And so we decided to, and we all were talking about different curriculum ideas and things that we were already doing. And so we decided to put this all together and apply for a grant through the Spencer Foundation, which supports this type of pedagogy. And so we got the grant. And so now we've been working on this, and we spent the last year and a half or so just reading literature and discussing how we wanted to approach the framework for this. And so I'm going to show you the framework in a second, but I wanted to give you an idea of what were we reading over this year and a half that we hadn't already read. So we really dug into the history of education itself and looking at the Western roots of education and how that affects, and we've kind of seen that in several of the talks already, how that really affects how we approach teaching students. And maybe that's not always the best approach. And so then we started looking at anti-racist pedagogy, emancipatory pedagogy, fugitive pedagogy, and then also student empowerment. So we wanted to combine the essence of that. So what did we come up with? So this is our framework, and it leads our guiding principles for the plan that we're working on for course development. And so it starts with power, and that belongs to both students and the instructors. So thinking about our power dynamic in the classroom, but then also thinking of how we can empower students by educating them to think a little bit about the social structures that they live in and how biology and learning about biology relates to those social structures. And so I'm going to give you some examples of those coming up, but just think back to how biology may have been used in the past to hold people down, to other people. So I think we can all think of a few examples of those. And then we wanted to also include some historical context as part of that. So the examples I'll give you will show you a little bit about that. And then of course, we want to cover the biological content. And then kind of overshadowing this, so this is why we kind of had this as a shadow of the pyramid, is present and future self. So we really want to see, does what we want to do in the classroom really affect the student, and how does that happen? So does it affect their thinking and how they see themselves in biology, in the world, and so forth? And so we have some built-in pieces that help students and help us look at the student when they first come into class, and then the student when they leave the class. So there's actually two pieces to the intervention that we're working on. And so this is kind of the overall piece for the whole course. And so the intervention components include having an inclusive syllabus statement, so that's a requirement, at least one anti-racist learning outcome. And part of our plan is to provide some examples of that, which I'm going to give you a couple. And then introductory student voice tool, and I'll show you a couple examples of that. A pre-course reflection tool, and then a minimum of 3 equity-focused activities with a reflection built in. And so we came to identify 3 as kind of being the sweet spot, so that perhaps you may not have to redo your entire course, but you could embed about 3 activities fairly easily. And so we were trying to keep in mind faculty, the ease of faculty to implement this strategy. And then you can always, of course, include more if you choose, but we identified 3 as kind of being that sweet spot. And then a post-course reflection, and then a final reflection from the students. So we began implementing this into our classes in fall of 2022. And a couple of us are not teaching because we're in administrative roles. So I actually am one of those. And I have one of my faculty that I'm working with at my college implementing this. And what's neat is that we're all at different types of colleges. So a couple of us are at community colleges, a couple of us are at R1 institutions, and then one at a private college. And so we're implementing it at different types of schools so we can compare that. And then my faculty is actually doing it in a 100% asynchronous online class. So we're getting some different comparisons between online and in-person instruction. So we wanted to see how it affects or changes students, hopefully, in the end. And then we're still ongoing with data collection for this semester as well. So I did not include everything because I think some of the adjustments are straightforward that I listed. So I wanted to highlight a few of those since we have a short time together. So one of those is the syllabus adjustment. So I wanted to provide an example of what an equity-related learning objective might look like. And so this is just a sample of one that we used. So communicating a value of diversity and inclusion and commitment and respect for care of students. And so that is really the key piece to the learning objective that you want to include. So this is, again, these are actually 2 that we were using. And so we let faculty that were working with us or whoever was teaching use one that fit their class. We want it to be malleable for the instructors and not feel like a really prescripted thing. It has to really fit you and your personality and your identity. So the 2 where students will be able to evaluate and connect between biology, power, racial inequity, and social justice. So those were really the key things that we identified. So if you think back to that model that I showed you, our framework, those were the key aspects of that. And then another one could be students will be able to use course knowledge to develop 1 or more strategies to reduce care or service disparities that result from racially driven power imbalances. So very similar, just a little bit fancier, and doesn't really include the biology aspect. So once you've provided those things to students and perhaps had a discussion depending on the format of your class, the other key piece is really building the relationship with students in the first week. And so one of those is really focusing on collecting some data from your students. So if any of you have seen Brian's work, he's a big proponent of knowing who your students are. And this document that I have up on the screen is actually from one of our colleagues in the group, Tess Kilpack, and she developed this first week survey. And so you can collect the references. It's on the screen if you'd like to download this. It's a nice short article if you really want to share something with other faculty in your department on collecting some data in the first week of class. This is a really nice short article with the sample built in. So we really want to emphasize that humanism part of the class in the first week and the connection between the instructor and students, and that this is really a collaboration of the instructor helping the students to learn. We also want to emphasize that collecting this data provides students a voice to share some things with you that in an introduction that's verbal, they may not be willing to share those things. So this is a way for them to connect with you and provide some information that might inform how you work with them throughout the semester. It's also kind of a values affirmation activity, and you can add some additional questions if you'd like to the survey. So this just gives you a kind of a starter for that. And this, like I said, this intervention, this piece of the intervention is really aimed at promoting that interpersonal connection with students and helps provide some social context to the student. And so they may not always think that they're valued and that instructors care about how they come into the class in the problems that they may bring with them that may affect their learning. And so it brings in that culture of care and acknowledges that they have some community cultural wealth. So that was actually a piece of the readings that we did to inform this as well. So once we get through this first week of relationship building, then we can start implementing the equity focused modules. So they don't necessarily have to be spaced out in any particular order. So it just depends. We wanted to really focus these modules on the needs of the instructor. So what we did as a team, because we all have different expertise in biology, we each created, we created a template for these modules so that instructors are able to build their own modules. And I'll give you kind of the sample of what's in these modules coming up. But thinking about perhaps someone might need some help getting started. So we wanted to provide some ready-made samples for instructors to use. So based on our individual expertise, we each created 3 modules that we implemented. So 2 to 3 usually, depending on our availability and time. So I created 2. And mine was actually on Indigenous knowledge versus Western science and some comparisons related to bog ecology. And then also I did one on some race-related systemic health disparities related to the Flint water crisis. And so both of those would include the biology aspects related to those. And then some of us included ecotoxicology and environmental justice pieces. Some focused on skin color. I didn't list them all here, but we have about 9 ready-made modules that we're testing out in the classes so we could get started. So our hope is then to share those as well. So this is the framework that we have in our module template. So when we first start out, you have to have a framework. So thinking about our overarching framework of the model that I showed earlier, we want to think about what is the framework that you need for this particular topic. And so, for instance, in my BOG module, I was thinking about all the background work that students would need. And so how can we build that in? And so then that leads into instructor pre-work. So that we identified as a really key piece of the equity focused modules, because sometimes we just jump in and we don't actually learn about what we're, when we're trying something new, we all have limited time. And so we wanted to really identify that that's really important when you're doing the equity focused work, because you don't want it to actually send a negative message to students. You really want to be sure that you understand the social issues that are part of the piece that you're working on. And so part of our template includes this instructor pre-work section, so where you can identify a couple of items that you would read or watch a video, etc. So we use podcasts. It depended on the topic. And then once you have done your pre-work, you can then identify the structures that you need to support student engagement. And so we then from these samples that we use for our pre-work, we could then make a list of things that we would use for the engagement for students. Then in planning, you have to identify what are the biological links. So thinking about the scenario that you want to use, that's the social structure scenario, what are the biological links? So for example, in my bog ecology, we looked at pH enzymes as part of the key pieces for that. Because the instructor I'm working with, that's what she wanted to focus on. And so thinking about the pH and the enzymes that might be involved in the bog or not, depending on how you want to look at it. So then once you identify the biology content links, then you write your learning objectives for the lesson. That's pretty straightforward. And then identify some of the pre-class work. So we wanted students to sit with the material on their own outside of class before they came in and think about the material a little bit, just to give them that processing time. Then we do a class activity, and then there's a student end of class activity reflection that goes in with that. And then once they do the activity, and the activity can be an individual or group activity, we really leave it up to the topic and how the instructor wants to implement it. Once we complete the activity, then there's a transfer and application assessment. So with that, we want to see, did they understand the social context that we were looking at within this scenario? And did they actually apply some biological knowledge and grasp the biological concepts that we are trying to teach during that module as well? So we really wanted to meld those two together to see if they could actually meld them together as students. One of the other key aspects that we identified as crucial is reflection. So we have multiple levels of reflection as part of this project. So there's a pre-reflection and a post-reflection that students get at the beginning and end of class. So this is part of the pre-class work. So when you're doing the data collection at the beginning of the semester, you can also include the statement. So this is actually the statement that we all used in our classes that I have on the screen. So we wanted students to identify coming in what ways can scientific practice be useful to improve society? Because after all of our reading and thinking about how science has been done, there's not always the connection with students that they're going to actually help society with what they do if they continue in science. And then we also wanted them to describe one or more examples in their response of this practice. So we use this question actually at the beginning of class and at the end of class to see if there's a change in the student responses over the course of the semester when the equity focused modules have been implemented. So if they take a different perspective on how science can be used to improve society. And then the other reflection that we use at the end of class that we wanted students to think about is, has taking this class with these equity focused modules, the whole experience that we created with this template, has it led you to think differently about yourself and or your path to a career in science? So we want to see if students end up feeling more of a connection to science by understanding how science affects society and how we can improve society, change society, and see things from a different perspective, is that creates a process or a way that students will want to stay in science. So we know that there's that leaky pipeline. And so we want to really see if it creates a sense of belonging, so they want to stay and not move on. And so this is really something that's identified in underrepresented students or marginalized students. They don't feel that sense of belonging. So our hope is that having this equity focused model, that it will create that sense of belonging that will get them to stay in STEM. So right now, our analysis is in progress. So I don't have data to share with you, but we wanted to kind of get some feedback on our model that we've created so far. So right now, we're collecting the written reflections from our fall classes, and then they'll be qualitatively coded. And we're using the critical race theory narrative analysis to do that, and then identifying themes from those. And then we're hoping that the themes will help us develop a narrative on how students identified race and power within the context of biology. And we also hope that there's a difference before and after, but we shall see. And so I've kind of mentioned this a little bit already, but some of the tangibles that we're hoping to end up with after the project is complete is disseminating all of the things that we've created. So there's a list of those. So the course modules, so we have the 2 templates, one for the overarching course, one for the modules themselves, and then the actual equity focused modules that we have prepared. And then we're just hoping that we can create a difference in biology education with inclusion of social issues and inequities into the biology framework. And so I thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions.
All right, thank you so much, Melissa. We do have a couple minutes here, so I'll read these questions in order. 1, do you use a rubric to score the pre and post reflections?
Yes, we do. That is part of what we're working on right now with the rubric. So we're hoping to share those out, but that's part of the project that's still in progress.
All right, and we have another question here. Do you feel like your class community has grown through this process?
In touching base with the team at the end of the fall semester, I would say yes. I know that I did not personally implement the exact module this semester, but some of these modules were the ones that I created were actual modules that I used when I was teaching at my other college before I moved to this college last year. And I would say we were seeing results then with just implementing 1 or 2 modules. And so I think based on our feedback, just anecdotally, like I said, at the end of the last semester, we were all seeing some slight differences in how students were perceiving their role as a scientist. So we're still kind of new in the data collection piece, so I can't give a definitive answer, but I would say anecdotally, yes, we're seeing some differences.
All right, thanks so much. Yeah, so while we sort of transition here, Jackie, could we watch that second question, second poll question that I had? All right, just kind of get a snapshot here. How long have we been teaching here as a group? All right, we are an experienced bunch here. 64%, nearly 2 out of 3 are at least 10 years, 10 plus years. About a quarter of us are 5 to 10 years, 6% 3 to 5 years, and then 6% are 3 years or less. There's always more we can learn, right? All right, I'm going to let Ethan go ahead and try to get set up here. Our fourth and final talk is from Ethan Strange, Oklahoma State University, talking about undergraduate students' perceptions of implementation of inclusive teaching in the life sciences. So I will turn it over to Ethan.
Thank you so much. And can I just get a little mic check? Are we good? Can everyone hear me clearly? Sometimes this mic is just silly as hell.
I can definitely hear you. Yes.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. Well, so hello, everyone. So my name is Ethan Strange, and I'm sort of a brand new PhD student over at Oklahoma State University with integrative biology. And luckily, I've been able to work with some of the new data that's come out from a new descriptive tool that some members of the Oklahoma State community have been working on. So I'd like to thank Caroline Mutetti, Amber Manning, Willette, Dr. Donald French, and then Dr. Jacinta Mutambuki for basically getting this project started and for allowing me to collaborate with them to work with our data. So as a brief overview, we're going to discuss, the importance of understanding these student perceptions and what they mean in regards to the inclusive practices that we'd like to either implement that might already be implementing or that might already be implemented or, has been absent within these spaces. So we're going to discuss what that might look like. We're going to also talk about how we created this tool using an inclusive framework and through a collaboration of faculty members and students to formulate it and make it clear as to be able to answer some questions about the absence presence of inclusive practices. We also want to mention that this was conducted in R1 minority serving institution in the South Central United States, and students answered a 34-question questionnaire on the potential inclusive practices within these spaces. And we'll also talk about the important capabilities that a tool like this could be used to either understand more, or we can even modify it to be able to describe spaces even outside of the school, either through extracurricular learning and other potentials. We'd like to also make a land acknowledgement that, at Stillwater, Oklahoma, that the land granted to Oklahoma State University, it was originally inhabited and cared for by First Americans. And we also recognize and acknowledge that Oklahoma State University resides and operates upon the territorial lands currently inhabited and preserved by citizens of the 39 sovereign tribal governments within Oklahoma. And as a land-grant institution, the university is committed to engaging in university community efforts to represent and honor the proud cultural heritage and history of Native citizens throughout the state and nation, including our students, faculty, staff, and alumni. OSU continues to respect and serve the sovereignty of the original indigenous people owners and protectors of these lands by cultivating and strengthening our institutional collaborations with sovereign tribal nations and their citizens. Now, when we're wanting to understand student perceptions, we want to look at how we look at inclusive learning. And so how we define it, how we discuss it, how do we identify these inclusive practices and how do we implement it? But with that, we also need to be able to include student perception into that equation, because there are tone setters for ensuring that our practice does make positive impact, especially for any students that are coming from marginalized identities and might be hindered within STEM spaces, both historically and within the present. So that accountability and that acknowledgement for these historical trends and assumptions, we want to bolster and ensure that any practice that we have and any information that we can use is garnered to help any of these marginalized identities. And so we could list so many more on here, but we decided that we can only do so much within the focus of a tool. So we are really hopeful that for what we work with, that we'll continue to be able to expand and modify this to accommodate and access more information on the diversity and plethora of student identity. So we know that inclusion is going to reinforce the use and support of building these stronger self-identities, and also promote the use of those identities within these STEM spaces, within school and beyond. And thus this feeds into creating a more inclusive civic participation. So we start in these schools and we utilize a good environment so that these students can carry this on and thus inclusivity can go beyond just the realm of the university, beyond the realm of a high school, any education system. We recognize that diversity is a net positive, and instructors should explore how their own classrooms, how their own identities and the identities of their students are going to shape those influences and make meaningful decisions within the STEM world. Now, we're talking about this descriptive tool. And so we're really kind of excited to be able to work with something that can help us identify, what student identities exist, and be able to evaluate, what does inclusion mean at the student level? And that inclusion is a much broader term than we give it credit, that there's just a lot of accommodations and a lot of different situations that may arise based off of those circumstances in that student's life. We also can use this to evaluate, what classes are either aware, non-aware, that are, presently using any inclusive activities, any of these teaching practices, and then be able to kind of simulate, what do these spaces look like? Now, to be able to understand it, we wanted to have a framework to use. And so this project was guided by the Inclusive Excellence Framework by Salazar et al., a publication in 2010. And that basically declares 5 dimensions that can be used in inclusive excellence frameworking. And so for our project, for what we wanted to look at and to interpret, how inclusive or the presence of these practices, we utilized 4 of these 5 dimensions. As interpersonal awareness is something that we didn't really want to focus in with the questions that we have, but still understand that it's a very strong inclusive presence and matter when understanding more on the student influence in that course. So within these, we have items that were confirmed after using exploratory factor analysis so that we can actually identify which one of our factors and whichever one of our question surveys or items would fit within these specific factors of inclusion. And then after that, we conducted confirmatory factor analysis to ensure that the questions that we have are best suited for those factors that we're looking at. And as a brief explanation, we wanted to make sure that we acknowledge that with our 4, we decided to combine curriculum and inclusive learning environment together. And this is just basically touching on that inclusive practice is present within curriculum content. And inclusive pedagogy is going to be focusing more on, that potential and that understanding that the instructor is aware of a broad diversity in their class. And then we look at interpersonal awareness to be able to identify, that sense of validation, any empathy, that invitation to be able to welcome the cultural ideas, on a student to instructor basis. So with these 3, we can use this to help score and analyze how these are being set. One thing that I did want to mention, though, before I go into this, I think I skipped it, is that we implemented a Likert scale. So whenever we're evaluating these spaces, 1 is going to represent that they strongly disagree that this inclusive practice is present. And then we have 5 representing that, yes, like they strongly agree or it is strongly present that this inclusive practice was in that course for that student. As a few examples for what the questionnaire items look like, we have 1 that represents from each of our factors and an associated loading factor score with it. And to confirm it and ensure that we were within realms, 0.70 is usually our guidance. But for some of our items, we were a little bit more closer within 0.65, 0.64, but we were able to confirm it using that extra assurance that through exploratory factor analysis that we did indeed have these specific factors. So we're really happy that a lot of these items did fit extremely well within the factors that we had. So how are we going to use it? Well, we can use this tool at least just for today's talk because it's part of a larger project. We're going to look at how students perceived instructor use of these potential ITPs, these inclusive teaching practices, between lower and upper level courses. So these are students that are either within freshman, sophomore level courses, 1,000, 2,000, and then the other half are upper level courses are 3,000 to 4,000. So it's more of like a beginner, intermediate, and then more of our advanced courses later. We'll also use this tool to be able to analyze how there might be differences between different demographic groups. So we picked 4 based off of the sample size that we had to run the data set. And we looked at gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and then also first generation status. And that first generation status was there to help implement the exposure to academia based off of preconceptions, possibly within the family or for people around. The location that the survey, it took place, yet again, it was at an R1 minority serving institution within the South Central United States, and it was done within the fall 2021 semester. And this was a part of a larger survey process where we had 7,000 total surveys that were sent out, and we received a fairly high response rate of around 600 after everything was said and done. So this 229 here is specifically representing those that logged in an opinion based off of a life science course. So this would be microbiology, plant biology, an introductory course in biology. So we were looking at about 9 to 10 courses that were a part of this section once we had all of the data. So we got a lot of numbers to work with, but the big picture from this is that when we're comparing our lower and our upper level courses after doing multivariate analysis, we don't see any statistical significance between their scores. But the big thing that we're going to want to do is kind of paint a picture on some trends that are going to be present throughout all of our groups. And we see that when we're comparing, you know, what is basically almost split down the middle and nearly split down the middle for our upper and lower students. And I want to just make a little point here that for 92 of our 229 students, those 92 came from introductory level courses or near introductory level courses. So historically, this has been a trend for students to have lower inclusive scores as they're transitioning from high school into their first academic class. And sometimes that intensity or the change in pace is something that makes them feel a little uncomfortable. So we kind of walked in anticipating that these scores might be inevitably lower. As we're looking through all 229 students together, we see that for our curriculum learning factor that we're sitting below a level 3 and at 2.49. 3 represents that there's sometimes that there may be occasionally some of these ITPs that are present within that course that are more curriculum and learning oriented. We do see, however, that for an inclusive pedagogy, so IP, and then for their interpersonal awareness, which I'll say as IA, they're very similar. And we're going to see this trend throughout. And it's kind of interesting as we can use this to start creating some ideas as to what might be happening, and then encourage us to be able to use this tool to, you know, find more details to explain these spaces. So when we're comparing lower and higher, they're almost the same. With the acceptance that with our upper level courses, they have slightly higher scores on their 3 factors. And we can kind of assume that since they're more comfortable and they're more inclined and in a space to where they're comfortable with learning, that they might already be accommodated for these classes, and thus their inclusivity score may not be as intense as far as just what the undergraduates such as freshmen and potential sophomores are taking these courses. Now, when we're looking at our demographic groups, we're going to see kind of what I would think is some sort of interesting discussions, but yet again, it's a very good step to have a descriptive tool so that we can start understanding, you know, what potentially one university within an area, what ideas, what perceptions, what identities are they going to encounter. And so whenever we're talking about our first demographic, when we're discussing gender, we had 2 groups. So we had individuals that identify as male or female. And when comparing them both at a specific structure level and overall, there's no statistical significance between the 2. However, we do see, you know, a large portion of the population of completed surveys, 181 of them were female, and then 35 of them were male. And when we're going to try to compare these scores and to try to create an understanding of the space, you know, IP for our male group is just slightly higher, though not statistically significant. Sorry about that. But yet again, I think the biggest picture that what we want is before we start making bold claims is that we make something that can be used for a wider sample size, a larger sample size, and that we can get clear, concise data and analyze it and compare it to what other disciplines are seeing within their spaces. So I think it's a very good comparative tool when we're talking about the demographics. When we're talking about sexual orientation, we once again had 2 groups. So we had students who either identified as straight, or we had students that did not. And we understand that there's a diversity of different orientations as well as gender, but for the sake of the survey and for what was answered, these groups had complete answers by the end of it, and anyone else that didn't have complete questionnaires were marked out. We needed to have full sets of data so that our model would be able to be valid and precise for an even set of data values. When we're comparing these two, much like gender, we're not seeing any statistical significance between this. But yet again, when we're comparing the comparison between the weight of the both groups, that we have more individuals representing those that are heterosexually identified and those that versus those that are not. But the scores tell us that they tell us kind of something a little bit that's interesting where they're matched. And if we're talking about, historic assumptions and we're talking about the trends, that we would assume that potentially students might have lower inclusive scores, but within this case and within our sample size, we see that there's something that's potentially there to where there's some inclusive practice, but however, we still see a relatively lower score in the curriculum learning environment. And we've seen that in all of our groups, and we're going to continue to see it with both ethnicity and our first generation status. So this was our first group that got close. It was approaching statistical significance. So that p-value is 0.06, and we're using 95% confidence interval. And the neat part about it too was that they also had significant difference compared when we're looking at minorities versus a non-minority group, that they were statistically significantly different in all three of them. But when we're looking at the whole model, they're not. So why would that be? Well, the representation of the minority group was fairly small. So we're looking at 36 individuals of the total 217 that disclose this information. I also want to acknowledge that whenever we're asking for identifying information, even though that names are not included, that students will feel awkward potentially whenever they're divulging this information, even if it's anonymous as we could make it. So we have to understand and kind of work with that and making a better means to find more students and to be able to account for all of these identities. So when we're comparing these two groups, our minorities, they scored higher. But yet again, we want to be careful because the distribution and the size of that is where we had that 36 students that identified within the minority group versus the larger amount, the 181 here. And so, but what we're going to hope to do is that we can use this as a basis to first start thinking of, where can we target these outcomes and where can we target these strategies based off of these scores. Now, first generation status was the last one that we wanted to report on. And we saw that there was statistical significance with this model and that we were really seeing it matter in the IP section, in that inclusive pedagogy section. Now, we're looking at more about 25% of our students are representing as a first generational status, which means that they're the first in their family to attend college, and that the other representatives have had either a member in their family attend or have collegiate experience. And so first generational students had very much lower scores, especially on that IP value right there. And so, this once again kind of brings in a target for discussion to go, why would IP be less in these areas? And that's why we really like the creation of a tool like this. But let's talk about the limitations real quickly. We need to replicate this. Other institutions should be involved, and we need to get, better generalizations and better ideas on, what inclusive instruction does look like and how these perceptions change across the United States and across other areas of the world. We need to maximize completion, and we always would appreciate a larger sample size. And with that too, we need to create a system that can work with triangulated data so that follow-up interviews, open-ended questions, we really start piecing in together those specifics to build those dynamics and truly understand what inclusion means for these students. So overall, there's rare use, as indicated by our survey, rare use of inclusive practices related to the curriculum and learning environment. Little sometimes used for our inclusive pedagogy and our interpersonal awarenesses, and this is just for life sciences, of course. And this may be partly due to, instructor unawareness of inclusive teaching practices, and that, the curricula has room to be shaped to accommodate for more inclusive practices that will embolden and help students better understand what inclusion may mean to them. Institutions, they should reward, incentivize faculty engagement for these teaching programs, and that the programs themselves they should model, these practical options that are going to revamp it without, causing great overhaul and stressing the system and bringing negative impact instead of something positive. So this incorporation of the materials, enhancing the materials, and making familiar experience with these students is going to build all that context and content relative information that will make them better participants in STEM. Our acknowledgements, we'd like to thank HHMI and OSU Foundation for being a part of this. I'd like to thank Dr. Mutumbuki for welcoming me into her group, and the faculties and the assistants of Oklahoma State University for reviewing these items and making this happen. And we have a lot of resources, and you're more than welcome to email any of us for more information on our descriptive tool.
All right, thank you so much, Ethan. We have a couple questions here. Did the race or ethnicity, the gender, the sexual orientation, or other identity aspects of the instructor affect the students' perspectives on inclusive teaching practices?
That's a great question. So we actually have, as this is part of a larger group of studies that we have with this tool, that's actually another question that we're looking at is the value of that identity from that instructor. But with this tool, we don't really get to know too much about, the specifics of who was taught by them and then how that identity alone shaped. But we feel that our questionnaire items would be able to suffice to at least interact and see, if any inclusive practice would have been implemented there. So we hope that with the extension with some of our other works that we expand on, the role of that faculty identity into, the presence and use of ITPs.
Okay, thanks. And then one last question here. Were the students given the option to choose a non-binary or NA option? I believe that's referencing the gender question.
Yes, this is. And so when we had the data set, and as I explained, so yes, they had the opportunity to pick non-binary and also NA. And unfortunately, whenever we got through and we were creating our stipulations for what would count onto the term, we inevitably saw that whole category was excluded after we cut it off. And our simple exclusion was that all 34 items needed to be answered. And so after that last analysis, we didn't have any representatives from there, but we did see individuals that did identify through a non-binary status or an NA status. They were excluded because they would either answer half of the questionnaire and then we get nothing to add on to that. It would create an unevenness on talking about the distribution.
All right, thank you so much, Ethan. And with that, the third annual Inclusive Teaching Symposium is drawing to a close. Once again, thank you to our wonderful presenters this year. I think we had a great slate of presenters. And also thank you to the attendees. I know we're trying to coordinate on a weekday afternoon across several time zones, and I know we all have very busy lives. So thank you for making the time. So as a reminder, the recording of this session, the session has been recorded. It will be available on the proceedings page, which Jackie linked to in the chat earlier. The link to the recording will be emailed to you if you registered for this event. And then sometime, this is all, sometime early next week. It will also sometime next week be posted on the YouTube page as well. Okay, so with that, I wish everyone a great evening, or perhaps early evening, depending on where you are. Take care, and we will see you all around. Thank you so much.